Well, hello everyone. My name is Yulia Ivanyuk-Squires, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. Thank you for joining the QX lecture series and today's session, The Mennonites and Their Slavic Neighbors, a case of resettlement and coexistence in the late 18th, 19th century, presented by Dr. Nataliya Venger. I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. And we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. So I have just one friendly reminder for everyone that this session will be video recorded and you will have an opportunity to ask your questions in the end by either raising your hand, or you can also try to submit your questions into the chat box throughout this presentation. For those who are not familiar with our center, with the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies, it was established in 1981, and it creates, preserves, and communicates knowledge and scholarship as it relates to Canada and Ukraine's unique history and relationship. We coordinate the Ukrainian Canadian Heritage Studies program. We offer interdisciplinary courses, and we promote research and host a lot of events, as some of you might be aware. We take pride in serving as a resource center for those interested in Ukrainian Canadian studies and also strengthening the relationship between the university and the greater community. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Dr. Nataliya Venger, who has been teaching the center's two courses this year, Introduction to Ukraine and The Making of Modern Ukraine, which are offered through the Department of History. So they're both history courses. Dr. Venger is currently a visiting scholar at the University of Winnipeg's Department of History and also at the Canadian Mennonite University. She's also professor of World History Department at the Dnipro National University and a director of the Center of German-Ukrainian History Researchers. Dr. Venger has an extensive and outstanding teaching, research, and publication portfolio. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Venger, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Yulia. Thank you for invitation and for this kind introduction. I'm really pleased to cooperate with the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies during this academic year, teaching history for Ukraine for the Canadian students. It was a great experience. And for today, I'm very honored to address to audience with the theme that concerns my research interest. It's the history of inter-ethnic relations, Protestantism in Ukraine, nationalism, and history of Russian Empire. In my presentation, I'll talk about Ukraine in the 18th first half of 19th century, a period marked by colonization, when Ukrainian lands became a new home for different peoples. I'm exploring the history of Mennonite relationship and cooperation with neighboring Slavic communities. Additionally, we try to reveal the emotional content of the colonization, arguing that the different legal conditions provided for the Mennonites and other ethnic groups, especially neighboring Slavic population, as well as the different economic results of the colonization, served as a catalyst for future resentment and ethnic stereotypes. Let me start with a story that happened in a late summer evening, 1789, in the Khortytsa tract, not far from Alexandrovsk fortress, Zaporizhzhia city at present. The sun was setting as the wagons of travelers slowly pulled into the territory of the village of Grigorievka on Khortytsa Island. It seemed they were stopping for the night, but it was a wrong assumption. It was a group of Mennonite settlers who have arrived in the land of Ukraine from Polish Prussia, to be precise, the vicinity of the famous trading city of Danzig. Avoiding religious persecution, they had undertaken a long journey and came to start a new life. The arrival of the newcomers was not unnoticed. In early morning, the Mennonites welcomed the guest. He turned out to be a Cossack, Colonel Ivan Babura, who lived nearby. After the annexation of Ukrainian lands and the destruction of Zaporizhia siege by the Russian Empire, he joined the military service of Russia and received a plot of lands in his possession. Babura considered Khortytsa area his homeland. He monitored all the events taking place nearby. The first meeting of the Cossack and the Mennonites sparked mutual sympathy. The next day, Babura sent a couple of geese, ducks, and chickens as a present to the Mennonites. This story was described by the Ukrainian ethnographer Yakov Novitsky as it was recounted by the local Mennonites who were the descendants, the second generation, actually, after the first settlers. That first story can be considered as a metaphor for the future contacts. Being neighbors, Mennonites and people lived nearby, watched each other, learned from each other, cooperated, and of course, couldn't avoid conflicts. In this case, the history of the relationship between Mennonites and their neighbors is more of a rule than an exception. And in this story, there is no place for historical accusation because each ethnic group acted according to its mentality, logic, interest, as well as the traditions of customary law. Some information about historical background. The Mennonites, representatives of the Anabaptist movement from the period of Reformation, came to Ukraine as colonists. They were among various foreign settlers invited as a social resource to develop the new lands of the Russian Empire's southern territory, formed as a result of military campaigns, the destruction of the Ukrainian Hetmanate state, the dissolution of the Zaporizhian siege, as well as partition of Poland in the second half of the 18th century. For those annexed lands, the Russian Empire was purposefully looking for politically neutral, skillful, and loyal to autocracy human resources. Because of this, the new southern lands were carried out according to the scenario of settlement colonialism. This term refers to a structure that perpetuates the destruction of indigenous, in our case Ukrainian Cossacks' economic traditions and structure, replacing them with a settler society of newcomers who were the colonists. Of course, the newcomers, colonists, including Mennonites, never guessed about their political role, their function in a political discourse. They arrived because they received an advantageous offer, a package of privileges, 65 descents of land per family, protection from slavery, exemption from military service, full autonomy in charge in internal community affairs, including education. At the very beginning, they even were offered to buy serfs, but Mennonites never agreed. These conditions were discussed with Prince Grigory Potemkin, who invited them to the Ukrainian lands on behalf of Empress Catherine II, even though it was completely his idea. Later, in their granted Charter of Privileges signed by Paul I, the Mennonites congregation were also targeted to perform a special didactic mission to be an example in agriculture, morality, and everyday life for the surrounding population. The first Mennonite settlement in the Khortytsa district were founded in 1789. On the other side, a significant number of Slavs, mostly persons from Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian region, as well as the representatives of other ethnic groups, Bulgarians, Greeks, Gagos, Nogais, and others moved to the territory of modern southeastern Ukraine between 1782 and 1858. This way, a heterogeneous ethnic composition of the population was formed, in which, according to Viktor Kabuzan, Ukrainians made up 60–70% of populations, Russians only 6–8%, Jews 1–5%, Germans themselves, Germans and Mennonites, about 2–4%. Despite different identities and languages, they had to communicate. 19th century historians and ethnographer Dmitro Yavornitsky and Yakov Novitsky were informed about the first contacts of the Mennonites with the Ukrainians. They spoke to Mennonites, Yulia Spitkau, Abram Loven, Ivan Hildebrand, Jacob Höppner, and some local Ukrainian people. Also, the interviewers were Syrian people. I believe we can trust the research because of two reasons. First, 19th century oral tradition was less distorted by external influences. And the second, researchers interviewed both sides, the Mennonites and the Ukrainians. The stories told by locals at the end of 19th century and generally confirmed by the last archival researchers. We know that the Mennonite colonies, Baburka, named after the local Cossack Babura mentioned above, Khortitsa, Nizhnya Khortitsa, Kapustyanka, were founded on the lands of the former Cossack settlers. As the old-timer reported, in the early years of their settlements, the spirit of Cossacks still prevailed there. Mennonites, who are always very concerned about their history, interested in local cultures. They collected historical items, and at least two small museums have been arranged by 1870. Sometimes, in dry years, sunk Cossack boats, notorious chaikas revealed from beneath of the Dnieper River, and local children used to die from them. In their stories told to Novitsky, the Mennonites mentioned more names of Cossacks who visited the colonies. Gromukha, Dvorinenko, Shut, typical Cossack surnames, as well as the stories concerning them. Mennonites kept both positive and negative memories about communication. The nature of interethnic contacts and their emotional accompaniment were determined not only by the differentiation of mentality, but also by the fact that Zaporizhian Cossacks used to be a military estate, warriors and travelers who used to go overseas and clashed with the foreigners in military campaigns. Therefore, they did not have the inclination to have reverence or admiration of foreigners. Despite the destruction of the new siege, they perceived themselves as the masters of the region, developing agriculture, industry, and trade. The Mennonites talk about Cossack Gromukha as a friendly neighbor who lived near the Baburka ravine. He was known for being welcoming, helpful, who gave some useful advice to the colonists about farming in their climate conditions. Also, the Mennonites mention Cossack Dvorinenko, who willingly collaborated with the colonists. It was a tall, strong, broad-shouldered man wearing white trousers, barefoot, armed with a sword. A real Cossack. However, the first meeting with him was marked by a rather unpleasant incident. After the first visit, the congregation found out that their horse was missing. A Cossack sword in the stable pointed to the thief. Mennonites managed to return the horse. It later came to light that Dvorinenko had an apiary and a farm. He was not a poor man. When he was asked why he had stolen that ill-fated horse, he replied without hesitation that he just couldn't change his nature. Matvey Shut, a Cossack, came from Chichikov Ferry, the future Ainlage colony site. Jacob Höppner described him as follows. He was a Zaporizhian strongman. His attire represented his motto of complete freedom. He wrote, he was wearing a white shirt with embroidered sleeves, blue-white trousers, and the father had a purse filled with ducats. Their first try to communicate was unsuccessful, but after a while they befriended. He became a fish supplier for the Mennonite community. According to Ukrainian storytellers, Matvey was not satisfied with the colonists' habit. He could never tolerate the frugality of the colonists and their lack of hospitality. Also, it's a quote, also Matvey visited the colony with his spoon. Presumably, a custom indicates the guest's readiness to share meal with the host. He always returned home hungry. He was never invited. All these simple recollections indicate, despite some ambiguity of situation, the local residents showed significant interest in the new settlers, expressing a desire to interact with them, showing hospitality, and being ready to provide assistance as much as they could. On the other hand, the Mennonites, as objective observers, claimed that when they arrived in Khortytsa, the Cossacks lived in comfort, spoke their native language, and felt in control of the situation. What a nice picture. However, the Mennonites either withheld some information or simply were unaware of the true state of affairs. When I say the ambiguity of situation concerning the Mennonites' arrival in the region, I mean that they were often accommodated on the land previously belonged to other settlements. For example, I already mentioned the first Mennonite village, Khortytsa, was founded on the place of the village of Novogrigorivka that belonged to Prince Grigory Potemkin and had been set up on the former Cossack village. In 1787, there were 48 peasants there. The buildings, the peasants' buildings, had been demolished before the arrival of the Mennonites. The foundations of the houses, including the Potemkin Palace, its main building of the village, were later used for the Mennonite houses. The Mennonites also used the bricks from the palace to build stoves for their first residence. The Mennonite colony of Nizhnya Khortytsa was established on the site of Lyubimivka village, which belonged to a member of a prominent Ukrainian family, Miklashevskis, maybe Polish Ukraine. Those land was bought by the government to resettle landless Mennonites from Khortytsa. To settle the Mennonites, the Miklashevsky serfs were to be relocated. Peasants were only allowed to harvest their winter crops. Thus, the first experience of communication was quite controversial for both sides. Again, avoiding any historical accusation, we can assume that these and other similar events created kind of stereotypes that would become archetypal as for the Mennonites as well as for indigenous Slavic people. I mean, the stereotypes were collected in ethnic memory and historical myth of given ethnic group revealing in the future political conflicts of the late 18th century. For example, the Ukrainian local residents complained to Yakov Novitsky. I told that he interviewed both sides, yes, that it was precisely after the arrival of the Mennonites when the local Cossacks were offered to choose another place to live. And many of them moved to the opposite bank of the Dnieper River, making room, presumably, making room for future Mennonite colonies. State peasants, Russian and Ukrainians, another social group with whom the Mennonites interacted and often conflicted. These stories will show another aspect of colonization, the lack of state management and miscontrol of the land resources. Nevertheless, as far as we can understand from the archival sources, in the first conflicts between Mennonites and state peasants, authorities tended to favor the Mennonites according to the settled colonialism scheme. The terms of resettlement of the Slavic state peasants were incompatible with the privileges of the Mennonites. According to observers, the contrast between the Mennonite and Russian Ukrainian villages was striking. And it was not just because of the zealous work of the Mennonites, but also because of lack of financial support. The prosperous Mennonite villages attracted the attention of their poor neighbors and random visitors who used to ask, "Do Mennonite pray another god?" Because of local misadministration, the Mennonites were involved in some conflicts with state peasants. One of them happened between Ukrainian Chichikov village and the Mennonite Chichikov colony in Molochna. That Ukrainian village had been established a decade before the Mennonites' arrival. The state peasants were given more than 3,000 descatines of land, but they also irrigated some additional land. Houses and barns had been already built on the plot, and the fields had been planted. Preparing to meet the first group of Molochna Mennonites, Guardian Committee, the special office that was responsible for the colonization, forced the state peasants to leave the stolen land. The villagers were explained that the reason Mennonites are coming. Also, the peasant left illegally seized land. The relations between neighbors were problematic. The conflict resumed in 1815 with a new force. That time it was about the cattle which belonged to the peasants, but roamed through the nearby Mennonite field, causing some damage. The Mennonites requested financial compensation while the state peasants asked for additional grazing lands and rejected to pay. The conflict was solved by Guardian Committee when the state peasants were given additional plot from the other side of their village. Sometimes disagreements between Mennonites and their neighboring population had more personal character. Quite a notorious story is about a miller, John Thieves from Molochna, whose water mill caused the flooding of the land that belonged to Russian village every year. It was a decade-long conflict that was tried in court. At last, he agreed to teach two boys from the village who wanted to become millers, as well as providing the locals with a free milling service. Some lands for Mennonites were taken from the Russian gentry, and of course, they were not happy about that. After Russian-Turkish War, Tsarina Catherine II actively granted lands to Russian aristocrats. The noblemen committed themselves to establish an estate, settle serfs, cultivate land, build. Many of them didn't keep their promise. Thus, before the first wave of Molochna Mennonite immigration, many lands of Nova Russia hadn't been cultivated, even though they had been in somebody's possession on paper. This kind of story was partly described in the famous novel Dead Souls by Nikolai Gogol. Chichikov is the main character of Nikolai Gogol's novel. It's a story of a landowner who, in the condition of colonization, seeks to obtain money from the guardianship committee for his false estate by registering non-existent peasants, dead souls. Looking for empty lands for the colonists, including Mennonites, the Guardian Committee made the decision to single out those false estates. I would say Chichikov's type estates, and gave the lands to the colonists. For instance, the estate that belonged to Captain Vukovich was returned to Treasury. The land was discussed to establish new Mennonite settlements with explanation. Quote, it will be much more beneficial for the state to give them to the Mennonites than to any other owners. Vukovich case, Chichikov case, provoked other inspections, and a lot of false homesteads were revealed to be typical of Mennonites. All these events, positive and negative experience, conflicts and consensus, reflect the difficulties of the first adaptation period. However, when it had passed, life settled into its routine, and the conflict mostly ceased. In 1837, the colonists were transferred to the gardens of the Imperial Ministry of State Domains that encouraged positive interethnic cooperation in the region. Concerning the Mennonite history, the years of 1830s, 1860s, we can call them as a period of big projects. By that time, the Mennonites had achieved significant economic success. Their colonies attracted the attention of random travelers, monarchs, but mostly the representatives of the Ministry of State Domains, who desired to use the Mennonite experience for developing future emancipation reform in the Russian Empire. It was important at that time the Mennonites had their leader, Johann Cornis, and then Philip Weber, who were both instigators of their own programs and good managers of the projects proposed by the ministry. Mennonites taught their neighbors to plant gardens and forests, set up potato farming. Finally, one of the most interesting projects concerned the training of Ukrainian and Russian teenagers in advanced agricultural methods. The main details of the project included resettlement of the teenagers aged 15-17 on the territory of colonies. A scholarship of 200 rubles, a lot of money, was to be paid to successful students upon completing the 10-year course. Unexpectedly for the boys and girls, they could obtain another privilege. It, by the way, could be considered as for granted for the Mennonites. During their participation in the project, both the apprentices and their families could be exempted from military conscription. The training program included various agricultural activities such as farming, haymaking, potato cultivation, tending to livestock, gardening, and working in the wood plantation. After Cornis passing away, his successor, Philip Weber, embarked on the mission to invite young people from Ukrainian and Russian settlements to acquire skills in cart making and blacksmithing under the guidance of Mennonite craftsmen. In total, 44 craftsmen from Molochny district actively participated in the program. All mentioned in the above project were successful, as they protected the Mennonites from the looming danger of Russian imperial nationalism, which came with modernization. With the onset of the era of nationalism, the Mennonites found themselves in the conditions of a new political reality. The Russian Empire was undergoing the great reforms, a process of modernization that was always accompanied by vivid discussion about Russian nation, its possible structure, religious core, and civil rights for included and excluded ethnic groups. As a Protestant, a German-speaking ethnic group, the Mennonites were placed beyond the national project. Over time, many of the former neighbors of the Mennonites, influenced by nationalism and later by left ideas, showed socialism, anarchism, took a hostile position towards the Mennonites. They would become members of so-called anti-German emotional community, shown by Barbara Rosenwein, demanding land redistribution, restriction of their religious and language freedom, accusing Mennonites pacifists of lacking patriotism. The peak of those processes coincided with the period of the First World War, the Ukrainian Revolution, and Nestor Makhno's uprising. This is a sorrowful but equally important period of history that deserves our special attention. This lecture suggests that the relationship between Mennonites and any other ethnic groups were an integral parts of their social experience in the Russian Empire and Ukrainian lands. Emphasizing the complexity of these processes, I am avoiding any accusation considering that each historical period has its own logic. Concluding this lecture, I cannot help but just touch the question of how contemporary Mennonites perceive their past experience and the role of other ethnic groups in their history. On this slide, two pictures are presented to show the parallels and similarities between Canadian and Ukrainian Mennonite sentiments about that. The first one is actually a quilt by a contemporary American-Canadian artist, Judy Gaspo Jutsi, who depicts Mennonite Aboriginal interaction. The second picture is a painting by Mennonite artist Henry Pauls from Ruslanders, who actually calls himself as a Russian Mennonite. The presence of such a theme in art indicates the importance and attempt to reinterpretation and possibly a desire to emotionally compensate for certain moments of the past. I would say this is a kind of social trauma, but for the contemporary Mennonites about their past. The Canadian artists portray the early contacts between Mennonites and the 6 indigenous nations. Flowing through the scene is the Grand River, meandering many Mennonites and Aboriginal symbols, including indigenous belt, with 2 parallel lines symbolizing cooperation. The right painting by Henry Pauls is called Russian Village. This title can be understood as a village from Russian Empire, and it shows how the artist fixed it in his memory. As a viewer, I perceive the scene not as a village, but a certain space that historically brought together various ethnic groups on its land. Actually, that is a typical Ukrainian village, populated by representatives of various nationalities from the entire region. Ukrainians, Russian, Romas, possibly Jews, possibly Turks, possibly the Mennonites in the right down corner. In fact, this is an exposition of ethnic diversity that's surrounded by Russian-Ukrainian Mennonites, the ethnic Ukrainian Mennonites, the ethnic picture of their world, presented with the straightforward language of primitivist art. This is a kind of perfect world, full of balance and harmony, where all cultures are represented as equal and friendly towards each other. At the same time, this narrow world is entirely historical, as it records the heterogeneity of the region, demonstrating the cultural outcomes of colonization. Without any doubt, this painting is filled with nostalgia, longing for the past, valuing their past. Russian Mennonites integrate their Slavic and other neighbors into their own history. They recognize the importance of the experience they acquired together with them. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Venger, for this insightful and fascinating presentation, for shedding some light on the subject of Ukrainian Mennonite relations, interaction, and coexistence that is still quite understudied. Got so much to discuss, and you've asked us some great questions in the conclusion too. So to our audience, you're invited to use your raise your hand option or also submit your questions into the chat box if you'd like to ask a question. Now, as everyone is thinking, I have a question that I was wondering about for Dr. Venger. What role did language play in the communication and interaction between the Mennonites, the settler Mennonites, and the indigenous Slavic neighbors? And how did Mennonites fit into the Russian imperial Russification project?
Yes, thank you for a very important question. Actually, when we say about the Cossacks, yes, we know, and the expert in Cossack history, they know that Cossacks actually didn't have language barriers. Many of them knew, maybe on the very elementary level, a lot of languages, at least because they communicated, because they communicated and lived in, for a few centuries in Commonwealth, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, which included Ukraine. So they actually spoke Polish and spoke some Latin. Not everybody, but many of them. And Mennonites, they came from Polish Prussia. So my guess, and it's a good question. I didn't find any, direct explanation, but my guess that because Mennonite came from Polish Prussia, so actually Polish Danzig, Polish territories, the language of communication for them could be Polish language, and also some Latin because they, read. They read Bible, etc., etc. So concerning the period of Russification, it was always a problem for Mennonite to start learning Russia. And when I mentioned Johann Pornis, it's on the picture, he encouraged the colonies to, and the colony school system to introduce Russian language into the program because it was very important for communication and especially important for those projects. When we say about these crown trainee projects I mentioned, so when the Ukrainian and Russian teenagers lived in German colonies for 10 or even sometimes more years, they had to learn Russian language, not Ukrainian. So it had to be a school for them, and also it was a requirement for them to visit the Orthodox Church. So they really were, I mean, the government, the local authorities, they were afraid of proselytism. So it was precondition to give all the opportunities for the teenagers to learn Russian language, some basic arithmetic knowledge, and some basic arithmetic knowledge, math knowledge, probably better to say, and visit Orthodox Church.
Thank you. So does anyone have any other questions? If so, feel free to submit it into the chat box. Well, there's yet another item that I was pondering about. You used the term settler colonialism to describe the relationship between the Mennonites, the newcomer Mennonites, and the indigenous populations. And we know that while initially the Mennonites might have been the benefactors of Russian imperial colonialism, later they also became victims of it. So in what ways are the stories of Mennonites and Ukrainians similar, and in what ways are they different?
So if we say about the scheme of settlement colonialism, I would say that it was a kind of similar but different national ethnic backgrounds, of course. So what was the core of this project? That it was that this kind of colonialism, settled colonialism, it's actually a structure that used to be arranged on the colonized territory to introduce new population and new economic system that was comfortable for the country who is carrying out colonization program. And of course, actually, it's mostly the history of the region. We should say that, the aim of the government was actually to put into the shade the local traditional, maybe Ukrainian project, and it includes sometimes the renamed of the cities, etc., to introduce Russian language. So, of course, I'm not a great expert about Canadian background, but I think that if we want to answer this question, we should start with the explanation about system. It had to be a system.
Thank you, Dr. Venger, for this astute response. And now we have a question from Johan. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Venger for this discussion and for the presentation. Well, based on what I've heard right now, well, definitely we can say that the Mennonites were very industrious people, and basically the closeness to German culture of Catherine II and the overall popularity of the like European, those kind of elements contributed to this project to settle them in the new conquered lands, which was Ukraine in question, yeah. But my question would be, what contributed to the decline of such a project to just like at some point to stop sending the Mennonites to the Ukrainian lands? Yeah, that's
So
interesting
what,
to hear.
okay,
Yeah.
so may ask you, so are you asking what declined and when it was declined? Yes?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, actually,
So,
what influenced that decline? Actually, whether it was the policy of the Russian government, because, well, maybe they thought Russian settlers would be better because Mennonites, they're industrious, but they still keep to their own, like do not assimilate the Ukrainians or Cossacks, or maybe it was some other things like the unpopularity of the like Ukrainian lands for the Mennonites because of this multicultural thing. So maybe, yeah, curious to hear that. Yeah.
I would say that we can't separate Mennonite case from colonization in general. So the law to stop colonization was passed in 1818, quite early, yes. But they mentioned that colonization continued till the 1858. And when colonization was banned for many other ethnic groups, the Mennonites, because they were so successful, and Johann Cornys himself, so they promoted colonization during this period. The decline of colonization was concerned mostly with the land resource. It was the one side of the medal. The other side of the medal was, the expenses that the government was ready to offer to continue this program. So, because when we say about colonization, a lot of members of the, guardianship, not guardianship, but ministries of internal affairs and the Ministry of State Domains, they actually, some people from the ministry, they were against colonization, and they said that, Russian government had to use money not for foreigners, but for Russians and Ukrainians. So, and these voices against the colonization were heard very early in the program of colonization. So, and that is why in 1818 colonization was stopped. So, because of few reasons: lands, money, and anti-indigenous. Let's say yes in English. Anti-indigenous
xenophobia, maybe.
Yeah, not phobia, anti-indigenous sentiments of colonization program. So because colonization was considered that it is anti-indigenous, program.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking.
Thank you for this great question. Dr. Venger, how did the Mennonite experience in Ukraine compare to that of Mennonite communities in other regions during a similar period, perhaps in Russia? As far as I'm aware, there were some settlements in Russia as well. Do you know if there were any major differences in terms of the systems of colonization, or were they pretty similar in both cases?
We should say that Ukrainian lands of the Russian Empire, yes, we can't say about Ukraine because it was not a state. When we say about Mennonites, when Mennonites came to Russian Empire, they settled on the Ukrainian lands. And resettlement over the Russian Empire started only at the end, at the beginning of 20th century, when we say Stolypin reforms. So it's very difficult to compare, because it's different periods, historical periods. But anyway, so in the phrase of Stolypin reforms, the Mennonites settled to Siberia, and at that time they were, quite prosperous Mennonite group. But again, on the other side, all the landlords, people wanted to resettle, because if you are successful on your place, you don't need to look for other lands.
So they were moving further east in order to work to obtain more land.
Because
for them to use.
because of because of demography. So the numbers of Mennonites was growing, and it was lack of lands. And Stolypin reforms, so they offered new lands in Siberia. So Mennonite participated in that program. But actually, then Stolypin halted it, because he saw again, it was anti-German sentiments, and it was a period of Russian nationalism. And Stolypin said that we should pay tribute to our Russian peasantry, not to German and former foreigners.
And if I may ask you to also take an excursion a little bit further down in history, and we look at the fate of the Mennonites in Ukraine in general, eventually when I would call it the empire is turning against them. I was wondering if you could unpack those facts for us a little bit.
Yes, I would say that probably it's a theme for next lecture, maybe, because we should say about the great national projects. On Ukraine, we used to have on Ukrainian lands 3 national projects. Yes, Polish, Ukrainian, and Russian national projects. Russian national project, it was about inclusion and exclusion. So which ethnic groups could be included into great Russian Empire nation. So Mennonites found themselves beyond the project. And so after that, they had to be restricted in their rights for lands, in their rights for language, for religion. It was a small period of maybe lights at the beginning of 20th century, when we say about the first Russian Revolution, 1905, when Mennonites that considered at the time not a domination but as a sect had more rights in religious, but it was a very short period, because after that the First World War came, when the Germans were really persecuted economically. And then Ukrainian revolutions also had some problems.
Very well, and I have one last question for you before we have to end our session, which is actually inspired by some of your conclusions from the presentation, and perhaps a question that could be based on some of the anecdotal experiences that you might have had working with the Mennonite populations here in Canada. So is Russia's full-scale war in Ukraine changing the attitudes of the Mennonite population towards Ukraine, towards their own history in Ukraine, towards the Russo-Ukraine war, and those sorts of things? Thank you.
Yeah, also it's a very good question. So the Mennonites were always great friends of Ukraine, and so I also study the language, how Mennonites are coming back to Ukraine. That happens in 1990s. And many of them traditional, call themselves Russian Mennonites. So it's a question of self-identification. And when the war started, so the question, how should we call ourselves? Sometimes I hear these questions. But history is history. You can't change. Yes, we can't change. If they identify themselves with Russian Empire, they actually identify themselves with Ukrainian lands, but Ukrainian lands were inside the Russian Empire. So it's they still call themselves Russian Mennonites. We can't change that, but now they're helping to Ukraine so much. They're the greatest helper of the Russian Empire and of the Ukraine and the condition of this extermination war.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone who is supporting Ukraine in this difficult time, and thank you to all of the today's lectures attendees for joining us for the QX lecture series, and of course the session by Dr. Nataliya Venger. Please stay tuned for more events in the future. We have a couple more lectures coming up in May and also a reading club session.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.